The story didn't begin with an official statement, a signed document, or even a confirmed source. It began, as many modern controversies do, with a ripple, quiet at first, almost easy to ignore, before it expanded into a wave that pulled, in headlines, speculation, and the familiar tension that seems to follow the modern royal narrative wherever it goes. At the center of it all are two names that have defined years of public fascination and media debate: Meghan Markle and Prince William. And now, attached to those names, a number that has captured attention across platforms: $20 million. The question being asked, repeated, debated, and dissected is simple on the surface but layered underneath. Did Meghan betray a $20 million deal? And if so, what does that mean in the broader context of her journey, her relationships, and her distance from the traditional structure of the British monarchy? But as with most stories that gain traction this quickly, the reality is far less clear and perhaps far more revealing about the ecosystem in which these narratives are created. What makes this situation particularly compelling is not just the size of the alleged figure, but the suggestion that the information originated from someone described as a former mentor. The word mentor carries weight. It implies trust, guidance, a relationship that exists before fame reaches its peak and often survives the early stages of success. When such a figure is suddenly positioned as a source of revelations, it creates a sense of authenticity, whether justified or not. It invites the audience to believe that what is being shared comes from a place of inside knowledge rather than outside speculation. Yet, even as the story spreads, one crucial element remains missing: verification. There are no publicly available contracts, no legal filings, no official confirmations that establish the existence of a $20 million agreement, let alone a betrayal tied to it. And still, the narrative continues to grow, because in today's media environment, absence of proof does not necessarily slow momentum. In some cases, it accelerates it. Behind the scenes, according to various reports and interpretations, the response from within royal circles has been measured, if not entirely silent. There is no dramatic rebuttal, no press conference, no direct engagement with the claim. Instead, there is something far more characteristic of the institution that British royal family has long represented: distance. A careful separation between what is considered official and what is categorized as personal, private, or speculative. And this is where Prince William enters the conversation in a way that has fueled even more intrigue. His so-called silent response has become a narrative of its own. Silence, in this context, is not interpreted as absence. It is interpreted as intention. Observers read into it, analyze it, assign meaning to it. Some see it as a refusal to validate the story. Others see it as a strategic choice to avoid amplifying a controversy that lacks substantiated evidence. And then there are those who interpret it as a sign of deeper tensions that are never fully articulated in public. The dynamic between William and Meghan has been the subject of extensive coverage ever since the shifting roles within the monarchy became public knowledge. Their paths, once connected through shared family ties, have diverged in ways that reflect broader changes in how public figures navigate identity, independence, and institutional expectations. So when a story like this emerges, it does not exist in isolation. It is immediately connected to a timeline of previous events, interviews, departures, and perceived differences in approach. For Meghan, the narrative is particularly complex. She exists at the intersection of celebrity, activism, and royal association. Her decisions are often framed through multiple lenses at once, each with its own set of assumptions and expectations. A financial claim, especially one as significant as $20 million, adds another layer to that complexity. It raises questions not just about the specifics of the alleged deal, but about the broader perception of her professional relationships and the way those relationships evolve over time. But again, the central issue remains what is actually known. At this stage, the answer is remarkably little. The claim appears to rely heavily on retrospective commentary and unnamed or loosely defined sources. The so-called mentor figure has not been universally identified in a way that allows for clear verification. The details of the alleged agreement are vague, lacking the kind of specificity that typically accompanies legitimate financial disclosures. And yet, despite all of this, the story continues to circulate, driven by the power of narrative rather than the strength of evidence. This raises an important point about the role of media and audience participation in shaping modern controversies. In an era where information spreads instantly and widely, the line between reporting and speculation can become blurred. Headlines are crafted to capture attention, to generate clicks, to encourage sharing. Nuance is often compressed into a few words, and those words can take on a life of their own. A question becomes a statement, a possibility becomes an assumption. And before long, the distinction between what is alleged and what is confirmed begins to fade. In this environment, silence becomes a strategy. For public figures, especially those connected to institutions like the monarchy, responding to every claim is not just impractical, it can be counterproductive. Engaging with unverified narratives risks legitimizing them. Ignoring them, on the other hand, can create space for them to dissipate, although it can also leave room for interpretation. For Prince William, this approach aligns with a broader pattern of communication that emphasizes restraint. His public role is defined by continuity, by a sense of stability that contrasts with the volatility of media cycles. By not directly addressing the $20 million claim, he maintains that position, even as the narrative attempts to draw him into a more reactive stance. At the same time, the story highlights the ongoing challenge faced by the monarchy in navigating a world that operates on entirely different principles than those that shaped its traditions. Transparency, immediacy, and accessibility are now expected in ways that were not the case in previous generations. The idea that a major claim could go unanswered, even if unverified, can feel unsatisfying to an audience accustomed to instant clarification. And then there is the role of the so-called former mentor, a figure who exists at the center of the claim but remains in many ways undefined. Without a clear identity, without direct statements that can be analyzed in full context, the credibility of the narrative becomes difficult to assess. It relies on interpretation, on second-hand accounts, on the amplification of fragments rather than the presentation of a complete picture. This lack of clarity is not unusual in stories of this nature. In fact, it is often a defining characteristic. The ambiguity allows for multiple interpretations, each of which can be supported by selective details. It invites speculation, debate, and, ultimately, engagement. From a media perspective, this kind of story is highly effective. It keeps the conversation going, encourages repeated viewing and sharing, and sustains interest over time. But effectiveness is not the same as accuracy, and this is where critical thinking becomes essential. For viewers and readers, the challenge is to distinguish between what is known, what is claimed, and what is inferred. It is to recognize that not every widely circulated story is grounded in verifiable fact, and that the absence of confirmation is not a detail to be overlooked. As the narrative continues to evolve, it is likely that new elements will be introduced. Additional commentary, further speculation, perhaps even attempts at clarification. Each of these will add to the overall picture, but they will not necessarily resolve the central question unless supported by concrete evidence. In the meantime, the story serves as a reflection of the broader dynamics at play. It illustrates how quickly a claim can gain traction, how easily it can be connected to existing narratives, and how difficult it can be to separate fact from fiction once the process begins. It also highlights the role of public figures in navigating these dynamics, balancing the need to maintain credibility with the desire to avoid unnecessary amplification of unverified claims. For Meghan Markle, the impact of such narratives is not just immediate, but cumulative. Each new story contributes to an ongoing perception, shaping the way her actions are interpreted and understood. Whether fair or not, this is the reality of being a figure who operates at the intersection of multiple high-profile domains. And, for Prince William, the situation reinforces the importance of consistency in public response. By maintaining a steady approach, by choosing when and how to engage, he reinforces the institutional identity that he represents, even as external narratives attempt to draw him into more reactive roles. In the end, the question of whether Meghan betrayed a $20 million deal remains unanswered, not because the answer is being withheld, but because the evidence required to answer it has not been presented. What exists instead is a narrative, constructed from fragments, amplified by repetition, and sustained by curiosity. And that space in between, where certainty gives way to interpretation, is exactly where this story continues to live and evolve. Because once a narrative reaches this level of visibility, it no longer depends on new facts to survive. It feeds on reaction. It grows through repetition. And perhaps most importantly, it adapts, reshaping itself to fit the expectations of the audience following it. In the days that follow the initial surge of attention, something interesting begins to happen. The focus subtly shifts. It moves away from the original claim, the alleged $20 million betrayal, and toward the implications of that claim. People begin asking not just whether it is true, but what it would mean if it were. And in doing so, the conversation expands beyond evidence into speculation, beyond verification into interpretation. For Meghan Markle, this shift is significant, because once a story enters this phase, it starts to influence perception, regardless of its factual foundation. The idea of a financial dispute, especially one framed as a betrayal, carries a certain emotional weight. It suggests conflict, broken trust, perhaps even ambition taken too far. Whether those suggestions are justified becomes almost secondary to the fact that they are now part of the conversation, and this is where the role of narrative framing becomes critical. The same set of limited details can be presented in multiple ways, each creating a different impression. One version might emphasize uncertainty, highlighting the lack of verification and the speculative nature of the claim. Another might lean into the drama, presenting the story as a revelation, a hidden truth finally coming to light. Both versions draw from the same source material, but they lead the audience in very different directions. At the same time, the presence of Prince William in the narrative continues to add a layer of complexity. His silence, already noted and analyzed, begins to take on additional interpretations. Some observers start to frame it as a form of quiet authority, a decision not to engage with what is seen as a media-driven storyline. Others question whether silence, in an era of constant communication, risks being misunderstood as indifference or avoidance. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of his position is how it reflects a broader principle within the British royal family. Historically, the institution has relied on a certain level of separation from public discourse, allowing time and distance to filter out what is considered transient. Not every story is addressed, not every claim is corrected. The assumption is that credibility is maintained not through constant rebuttal, but through consistency over time. Whether that approach remains effective in the current media landscape is an open question, because today's environment operates at a different speed. Stories rise and fall within hours, not days. Narratives are shaped in real time, often without the benefit of complete information. And in this context, the decision to remain silent can have unintended consequences, allowing speculation to fill the gaps left by the absence of official comment. Meanwhile, the idea of a former mentor continues to hover over the story, like an unresolved detail. The lack of clarity surrounding this figure becomes part of the intrigue. Who are they? What is their connection? Why speak now? Each of these questions invites further speculation, and each answer, real or imagined, adds another layer to the narrative. What is particularly notable is how the timing of such claims often intersects with broader cycles of attention. Stories do not emerge in a vacuum. They appear within a context shaped by recent events, ongoing discussions, and the natural ebb and flow of public interest. When a claim like this surfaces, it often aligns with a moment when the individuals involved are already in the spotlight, amplifying its reach and impact. In this case, both Meghan Markle and Prince William occupy positions that make them particularly susceptible to this kind of amplification. Their actions, their decisions, even their perceived responses are constantly analyzed, often through lenses that reflect broader cultural and social debates. And so the story continues, not as a fixed set of facts, but as a fluid narrative shaped by interpretation, It moves across platforms, from video to article to social media post, each iteration adding something new, even if that something is simply a different tone or emphasis. Over time, these variations accumulate, creating a composite version of the story that feels more substantial than any single source. But beneath all of this activity, the core issue remains unchanged. There is still no verified evidence of a $20 million deal. There is still no confirmed account of a betrayal. What exists instead is a network of claims, interpretations, and reactions that collectively give the impression of a story that is more concrete than it actually is. This does not mean that the story is without significance. On the contrary, it reveals a great deal about how modern narratives are constructed and consumed. It shows how quickly a claim can gain traction, how easily it can be connected to existing perceptions, and how difficult it can be to disentangle once it becomes embedded in public discourse. It also highlights the role of the audience in shaping the trajectory of such stories. Every view, every share, every comment contributes to the momentum. Engagement becomes a form of validation, signaling to algorithms and platforms that the story is worth promoting further. In this way, the audience is not just a passive observer, but an active participant in the creation and dissemination of the narrative. For public figures like Meghan Markle, this dynamic presents an ongoing challenge. The ability to control one's own narrative is limited in an environment where multiple voices are constantly interpreting and reinterpreting the same set of events. Even silence, which might once have been a neutral position, becomes a statement, in itself open to interpretation and analysis. And yet, there is also a certain resilience in this process. Over time, stories that lack substantiation tend to lose their impact, replaced by new narratives that capture attention. The cycle continues, each story following a similar pattern of emergence, amplification, and eventual decline. The question is not whether the cycle will continue, but how each new iteration will shape the perceptions that remain after the attention fades. In the case of Prince William, the emphasis appears to remain on continuity. By maintaining a consistent approach, by focusing on long-term credibility rather than short-term reaction, he reinforces a sense of stability that contrasts with the volatility of the narratives surrounding him. Whether this approach will continue to be effective in the evolving media landscape is something that only time will determine. As for Meghan Markle, the situation underscores the complexity of her public role. She is both a subject of the narrative and in many ways a symbol within it. Her actions are interpreted not just on their own terms, but as part of a larger story about identity, independence, and the relationship between public figures and the institutions they are associated with. And so, as the conversation continues, it becomes clear that the most revealing aspect of this story is not the claim itself, but the process through which it has been transformed into a narrative of significance. It is a process driven by curiosity, sustained by engagement, and shaped by the interplay between fact and perception. Because in the end, the question is not just whether a betrayal occurred, but how the idea of that betrayal came to hold such power in the first place. And the answer to that question lies not in a single statement or piece of evidence, but in the collective dynamics of a system where stories are constantly being created, shared, and reimagined. In that system, truth is not always the starting point. Sometimes it is the destination, arrived at slowly, carefully, and often after the narrative has already taken on a life of its own.